Don't take them with you. That warning was whispered on a freezing airstrip in southern Afghanistan in the winter of 2001. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't written in any official report. But inside several American command tents, the phrase circulated quietly among officers preparing for upcoming missions. The subject of that warning was not the Taliban. It wasn't Al-Qaeda either. It was a group of allies, a small detachment from the Special Air Service Regiment. At first glance, the situation sounded almost ridiculous. The United States had deployed some of the most highly trained soldiers on the planet to Afghanistan. Navy SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, and Delta operators were arriving by the hundreds. These were units built specifically to operate in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Yet within weeks of joint operations beginning, something unusual started happening. Some American officers became uneasy about working with the Australians. The reason had nothing to do with bravery. No one questioned the skill or toughness of the SAS soldiers. Their reputation was already well known in military circles. What troubled American commanders was something far more complicated. The Australians fought the war in a completely different way. While most coalition units relied on constant communication, heavy firepower, and rapid strikes, the Australians seemed almost determined to disappear. They traveled in lightly modified Land Rovers with minimal armor. They carried smaller teams into extremely remote areas. And once they moved into the mountains, they sometimes vanished for days. No radio calls, no status reports, no updates. From the perspective of American command centers, it looked like pure chaos. But to the Australians, it was simply how the job was done. To understand how this strange tension developed, it's necessary to look back at the opening phase of the war in Afghanistan. After the attacks of September 11th, the United States launched a massive military campaign aimed at destroying Taliban and Al-Qaeda networks hidden across the country. Special operations forces were deployed first, working alongside local allies and guiding devastating airstrikes against enemy positions. Within weeks, coalition planners created a multinational special operations task force designed to hunt surviving militant leadership in the mountains. That unit became known as Task Force K-Bar. The task force included elite units from several allied nations: Germany, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, Turkey, Australia, and of course the United States. On paper, it looked like the ultimate special operations team. Each country brought its best operators. Together they would conduct reconnaissance, capture high-value targets, and disrupt enemy networks across southern and eastern Afghanistan. But in reality, the moment these units began planning missions together, a serious problem appeared. They all had different ideas about how modern warfare should work. The American military approach relied heavily on overwhelming power. If a patrol discovered enemy fighters, the response was immediate. Aircraft were called in. Precision munitions were dropped. Helicopters inserted reinforcements. The goal was simple: strike hard and fast before the enemy could escape. In the early months of the war, this system seemed unstoppable. B-52 bombers pounded Taliban front lines. Attack helicopters hunted vehicles across the desert. A C-130 gunships turned fortified compounds into burning ruins within seconds. From Washington's perspective, the formula was working perfectly. Massive firepower combined with advanced technology was breaking the enemy faster than anyone expected. Many officers privately believed the war might end far sooner than predicted. But hidden beneath that impressive display of power was a weakness that few planners had fully considered. The American military machine was extremely visible. Every helicopter flight, every radio transmission, every large-scale movement created signals that could be observed by anyone paying attention. In the open deserts of Afghanistan, that didn't matter very much. But the mountains were different, and that was exactly where the Australians preferred to operate. The Special Air Service Regiment had built its reputation on a very different philosophy of warfare. Instead of overwhelming firepower, their doctrine focused on stealth and patience. Small patrols could insert deep into hostile territory and remain hidden for extended periods of time. Rather than attacking immediately, they studied the environment. They watched supply routes. They mapped out safe houses. They tracked communications between enemy units. Sometimes they waited for days before taking any action at all. To American commanders, this seemed painfully slow. If elite soldiers had already located enemy fighters, why waste time watching them? Why not eliminate the target and move on? But the Australians viewed the situation differently. Destroying one group of fighters might produce a quick victory, but observing them long enough could reveal an entire network. Where they came from, where they were going, who commanded them. That information could be far more valuable than a short firefight. So the Australians waited. This method created immediate friction inside coalition command centers. In the American system, communication was constant. Every patrol regularly transmitted position updates. Digital maps in tactical operations centers showed the location of friendly forces in real time. Commanders monitored movements minute by minute, ready to dispatch support if something went wrong. The system depended entirely on radio traffic. Without it, the entire operational picture disappeared. The Australians, however, often operated under strict radio silence. Sometimes they communicated only through short-coded bursts, tiny signals that revealed almost nothing about their location. To American staff officers staring at large screens in command tents, this behavior was alarming. Several times during the early months of operations, Australian patrol markers simply stopped updating on the map. Then, they vanished completely. Inside the operations centers, tension quickly rose. Had they been ambushed? Were they surrounded? More than once, preliminary discussions about search and rescue missions began quietly among American planners. Then, just as suddenly as they had disappeared, the Australians would return. Cold, tired, but carrying extremely detailed intelligence about enemy activity deep inside the mountains. The cultural divide between the two forces continued to grow. American officers believed the Australians were taking unnecessary risks. The Australians believed the Americans were making far too much noise. At first, these disagreements remained behind closed doors in planning rooms and briefings. But the argument would soon move from theory to reality. Because in early 2002, coalition intelligence identified a large concentration of militant fighters gathering in a remote mountain valley. Commanders believed hundreds of enemy troops had regrouped there. The decision was made to launch a major operation to destroy them. It would involve conventional infantry, airborne units, helicopters, and special operations teams working together in a massive, coordinated assault. On the planning maps inside headquarters, the mission looked straightforward. But high above that valley, hidden among the snow-covered ridgelines, a handful of Australian patrols had already begun to see something very different. And what they discovered would soon change the entire battle. In early 2002, coalition intelligence analysts began focusing on a remote mountain basin in eastern Afghanistan. Reports from local sources suggested that a large number of al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters had regrouped there after the collapse of major cities the previous winter. The area was a harsh region of jagged ridgelines, steep rock walls, and narrow valleys where winter temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Few roads reached it. Most movement happened on foot along hidden mountain paths. American planners believed the basin could be turned into a decisive battlefield. The plan was straightforward. A large conventional force would move into the valley floor and sweep through the area. Helicopters would insert blocking units on the surrounding terrain to prevent fighters from escaping. Special operations teams would guide aircraft onto enemy positions, while Afghan militia helped secure the outer perimeter. The operation was given a new name inside coalition headquarters: Operation Iron Spear. In the briefings, it looked like a textbook maneuver. The units assigned to the assault included elements from the 10th Mountain Division and the 101st Airborne Division, supported by elite teams from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Commanders expected resistance, but nothing overwhelming. Intelligence estimates suggested several hundred fighters at most, lightly equipped and scattered across the region. The entire operation was expected to take 3 days. What many planners did not fully understand was the terrain. The valley itself looked manageable on satellite imagery, a wide bowl surrounded by high ground. But those mountains rose sharply, and in many places they towered thousands of meters above the valley floor. Anyone controlling the heights could dominate everything below. Inside the command tents, however, those ridgelines were largely considered empty. The assumption seemed logical. Holding positions that high in winter would be extremely difficult. Snow covered many of the slopes. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Supplying fighters at those altitudes would be slow and dangerous. Most intelligence officers concluded the enemy would prefer to stay lower, where movement was easier. But that assumption turned out to be dangerously wrong. Several days before the main assault was scheduled to begin, small reconnaissance patrols were already moving through the mountains. Among them were teams from the Special Air Service Regiment. The Australians had quietly inserted into the region using helicopters and long-range vehicle movements during the night. From there, they continued on foot, climbing through narrow passes and rocky slopes that few others wanted to navigate. Each patrol consisted of only a handful of operators. They carried minimal gear compared to conventional troops. Most of their equipment focused on observation, optics, laser designators, communication systems, and survival supplies. Their mission was simple: watch. One patrol reached a narrow ridge overlooking a key section of the valley. From that position, the team could see several kilometers across the terrain below. At first, the valley looked quiet, but as daylight faded and night approached, the picture began to change. Through high-powered optics, the Australians started noticing movement along narrow trails on the opposite slopes. Small groups of fighters appeared, disappearing between rock formations and cave entrances. Vehicles arrived under the cover of darkness. Supply animals followed. Then came the heavy weapons. Mortars were moved into concealed firing pits. Machine gun positions were dug into rocky ledges overlooking the valley floor. Some positions were reinforced with sandbags and carefully camouflaged from above. It became clear that the enemy had not abandoned the high ground. They had fortified it, and they had done it extremely well. Over the next several days, the Australian patrols continued observing. They counted fighters. They mapped defensive positions. They identified communication routes and supply lines moving through the mountains. Most importantly, they recorded exact grid coordinates for every major weapon system they could locate. Some of the observation posts were frighteningly close to the enemy. In one case, a patrol watched armed fighters walk along a mountain path less than 50 meters away. The Australians remained completely motionless, hidden among rocks and snow. The fighters never noticed them. For the SAS operators, this was exactly the kind of situation their training prepared them for. They simply waited. Meanwhile, inside coalition command centers, far from the mountains, the operation moved forward. Aircraft were scheduled. Helicopter assault routes were finalized. Infantry units prepared to move. From the perspective of planners studying satellite images and intelligence summaries, everything still looked manageable. Enemy resistance was expected to be limited. The mountains above the valley were still assumed to be lightly defended. And the Australians' quiet reports, transmitted carefully and often with delays due to radio discipline, had not yet fully changed that perception. But the patrols on the ridgelines knew something different. They were looking directly at an ambush. On the night before the assault began, temperatures dropped sharply across the mountains. Snow covered many of the ridgelines, and strong winds swept through the high passes. Inside their concealed observation posts, the Australian teams stayed completely still. They had been watching the valley for days. Now they were waiting for the battle to begin. At first light the next morning, helicopters carrying American troops began moving toward the valley. Large formations of infantry prepared to land and push through the basin below. Within minutes of the first landings, the operation began to unravel. Machine guns opened fire from the mountains. Mortar rounds began falling among the advancing units. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked toward helicopters approaching the landing zones. The ridgelines that had been assumed empty suddenly erupted with gunfire. From above, dozens of hidden positions poured rounds down into the valley. What had been planned as a fast 3-day operation was instantly turning into a brutal fight for survival. American troops on the valley floor found themselves pinned down by overlapping fields of fire from enemies holding the high ground. Some helicopters were forced to pull away from landing zones under heavy attack. Others struggled to insert troops while taking fire. The battle had only just begun, and already the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had expected. High above the chaos, hidden among the rocks and snow, the Australian patrols finally began to move. For days they had been watching. Now they had something far more valuable than weapons. They had information. And that information was about to change the battle. As the battle in the valley intensified, confusion quickly spread through coalition command channels. Reports coming from units on the ground painted a very different picture from the one planners had expected. Instead of scattered resistance, American forces were facing coordinated fire from multiple directions at once. Machine guns hammered landing zones. Mortars began dropping shells with disturbing accuracy. Enemy fighters were not running. They were holding their ground. Within the first hours of the operation, it became clear that the militants occupying the mountains had prepared their positions carefully. Many of their weapons were placed high above the valley, allowing them to fire down on troops moving below. That advantage was devastating. Units advancing across the open terrain suddenly found themselves exposed to fire they could barely see, let alone suppress. Radio traffic inside command centers became frantic. Requests for air support flooded the network. Attack helicopters were redirected again and again, trying to locate enemy firing points hidden among rocks and snow. But finding targets in the mountains was far harder than expected. From the air, many of the defensive positions were almost invisible. The fighters had chosen their locations well. Several kilometers away from the valley floor, hidden on one of those very ridge lines, a small team from the Special Air Service Regiment watched the battle unfold through their optics. For days they had been studying the enemy defenses. Now every detail they had recorded suddenly mattered. One operator tracked a machine gun nest positioned just below a jagged ridge crest. Through his scope, he could see the weapon firing bursts toward American troops struggling across the valley. Another member of the patrol confirmed the grid coordinates. A third operator quietly prepared the communications equipment. Unlike the chaotic radio chatter filling other channels, the message transmitted from the observation post was calm and precise. Exact coordinates, weapon type, estimated number of fighters. Within minutes, that information reached aircraft already circling above the battlefield. Moments later, the sound of approaching jets echoed across the mountains. A precision-guided bomb slammed into the ridge. The machine gun position disappeared in a burst of smoke and debris. For the soldiers pinned down on the valley floor, the effect was immediate. One of the most dangerous enemy firing points simply vanished. And it was only the beginning. Across the mountains surrounding the valley, several other Australian observation teams began transmitting similar targeting data. They had been watching these positions for days. Now they knew exactly where each one was. Instead of searching blindly for enemy fighters hidden among the rocks, aircraft were suddenly receiving confirmed coordinates for specific weapons. Mortar pits, heavy machine guns, command positions. The results were dramatic. One ridge that had been pouring constant fire into the valley suddenly fell silent after a series of airstrikes guided directly onto its defensive line. Another machine gun nest that had pinned down advancing infantry was destroyed within minutes once its position was transmitted. The pattern repeated again and again. Enemy guns would open fire. Shortly afterward, aircraft would arrive. Then the position would disappear in a flash of explosions. For American troops fighting below, the change felt almost surreal. Just hours earlier, they had been under relentless attack from unseen positions above them. Now, one by one, those positions were being eliminated with increasing accuracy. Pilots flying overhead quickly realized that someone on the ground had an extraordinary view of the battlefield. And whoever it was understood the terrain perfectly. Inside coalition command centers, the situation was slowly becoming clearer. The targeting information guiding the airstrikes was coming from small reconnaissance teams operating high in the mountains. Most of those teams belonged to the Australian SAS. Their reports were remarkably detailed. Not only were they identifying enemy weapons, they were also describing the layout of defensive networks across the ridgelines. Some teams had been watching specific positions for days before the battle even began. They knew where fighters moved during the night. They knew which caves were used as storage sites. They even knew the direction certain weapons would likely fire once the battle started. That level of detail was something satellite imagery and remote intelligence simply could not provide. It came only from patient observation on the ground. The battle continued for several more days. Fighting was intense. American forces on the valley floor still faced determined resistance from fighters defending their positions in the mountains. Helicopters repeatedly flew into dangerous areas to insert reinforcements or evacuate wounded soldiers. At several points, the situation came dangerously close to spiraling out of control. But the steady flow of targeting data from the reconnaissance teams on the ridgelines kept shifting the balance. Each new strike removed another defensive position. Each destroyed weapon reduced the pressure on troops below. Gradually, the network of enemy strongpoints began to collapse. What made the situation remarkable was that most of the soldiers directing those strikes had barely moved for days. Inside their hidden observation posts, the Australian patrols remained almost completely still. They continued watching the battlefield, adjusting coordinates, and identifying new threats whenever enemy fighters attempted to reposition. It was the same method they had used from the beginning. Observe, record, wait, then act at the right moment. By the time the operation finally ended, the valley that had been expected to produce a quick victory had instead become one of the most intense battles of the early war. Coalition forces had faced far stronger resistance than predicted. Many soldiers had been wounded. Some had been killed. But the enemy defenses had ultimately been broken. And a large part of that success came from information gathered by the silent teams positioned high above the battlefield. For several American officers who had once questioned the Australians' unusual tactics, the lesson was impossible to ignore. The soldiers who had seemed overly cautious just weeks earlier had provided some of the most valuable intelligence of the entire operation. Their patience had allowed them to see what satellite images and quick reconnaissance flights had missed. And when the battle began, that knowledge became decisive. But the real impact of the operation would only become clear later. Because the events in that mountain valley quietly changed the way many coalition special operations units began thinking about reconnaissance and patience in combat. And the influence of that lesson would continue long after the battle itself was over. By the time the American task force reached their forward operating base near the remote village of Kumarak, Dusk had already settled over the jagged mountains. The wind howled through the narrow passes, whipping up clouds of dust and loose gravel. Helicopters thudded into the makeshift landing zones, sending dust swirling across the tents, crates, and vehicles. Inside one of the command tents, Major Thomas Grayson dropped his helmet onto a table, cluttered with maps, satellite images, and encrypted radios. The men around him were silent, fatigue etched into every line of their faces. Finally, Sergeant Alex Hunter muttered, "Hell of a day." Grayson didn't respond immediately. He studied the map spread out before him. The operation had not gone as planned. Intelligence had underestimated the concentration of enemy fighters entrenched in the valleys. What they had assumed was a small resupply cell was actually a forward observation post, guarding a larger network moving through Comarak's high passes. "If we had walked in blind," Grayson said slowly, "we'd have been surrounded in minutes." Across the table, Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole cleaned his rifle. "Think they knew we were coming?" "No," Grayson replied. "They didn't need to. They live out there. They watch everything." That was the difference between the two forces. The Americans relied on overwhelming firepower, satellites, and drones. The Australians relied on patience, stealth, and centuries of tactical instinct. Outside the tent, the Australian Special Air Service Patrol quietly packed their gear, almost invisible amid the chaos of the base. A few American soldiers walked past them, curious. "Thought you'd be celebrating or something," one said. The Australian corporal glanced up. "We're alive," he replied. "That's enough celebration." A few Americans laughed, but the words carried a weight that lingered. They understood that the Australians' method, moving silently, observing for days, striking only at the perfect moment, had saved lives that day. Later that evening, near a makeshift fire barrel, the two units began to gather. It was a small, awkward ritual. Someone had found a box of instant coffee packets. The bitter brew did little to warm frozen hands, but no one complained. Major Grayson approached the Australians' patrol leader, a tall, lean man with piercing eyes. "Evening, Major," the Australian said simply. "Evening," Grayson replied. There was a pause. Then he said something that surprised several of his men. "You were right about the ridge," Grayson admitted. The Australian raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "You said we were moving too loud, that we'd tip them off." The Australian shrugged. "Usually the case." There was a quiet chuckle among the Americans. "How long did it take you to learn that?" Grayson asked. "First time I almost got killed," the Australian said calmly. "That tends to speed up the lesson." The Americans laughed, but respect was growing in their eyes. Earlier in the week, the Americans had seemed unstoppable. Helicopters, heavy firepower, constant forward momentum. Now, after watching the Australians navigate the mountains without a single trace or contact, they understood something crucial. Raw power was dangerous, without precision, patience, and observation. Later, Staff Sergeant Cole wandered over to where the Australians had set up a temporary observation post. The patrol leader was hunched over a small notebook, writing notes on enemy movements, supply lines, and terrain. "Mind if I sit?" Cole asked. The Australian gestured to an empty crate. Cole sat, and the two men watched the jagged peaks and valleys in silence. "You always move like ghosts?" Cole asked. "Only when someone is watching," the Australian replied. Cole shook his head. I didn't even hear you this morning." "That's the point," said the Australian. Cole considered that, then spoke honestly. "You probably saved our asses today." "Maybe," the Australian said. "Or maybe next time, you save ours." Cole looked toward the helicopters on the landing pad. "We're pretty good at that part." They laughed quietly, but the mountains offered no comfort. The enemy could be anywhere. The night was long, the terrain unforgiving, and mistakes could be fatal. Before midnight, new intelligence crackled over the radios. Another convoy was moving through a narrow valley to the northeast. Officers pored over the maps, calculating insertion points and potential ambush zones. The next mission was forming even as exhaustion weighed on every soldier's shoulders. Outside, the Australians checked their equipment with the same meticulous care that had guided them through countless operations. One of the Americans noticed. "Thought you were done for the night," he said. "In places like this," the Australian replied, "you're never done." Within the hour, helicopters were spinning again. Dust and snow mixed under the rotor wash. Engines roared into the darkness. Americans and Australians boarded side by side, moving as a single unit despite their different methods. Major Grayson climbed into the lead helicopter. Across from him, the Australian patrol leader secured his harness. Their eyes met, and for the first time, no words were needed. They understood each other. Mutual respect had been forged in fire, snow, and silence. As the helicopters lifted into the dark mountains, the wind swallowed the sound within seconds. Below, enemy fighters moved through the valleys, unaware of the patient, silent hunters above and among them. Tonight, two ways of war moved together: American speed and firepower, Australian patience and stealth. Together, they were far deadlier than either alone. And in Kamarak, that combination would ensure that the next battle would be fought on terms the enemy would never anticipate.